Estates, Department of Conservation, Biodiversity Conservation Restrictions, mouthful. Just here to talk to you about my experiences working with experimental translocations on mine sites, and a little bit about our planting techniques and site preparation. So just to provide a little bit of context about the juxtaposition between threatened species and mining activities, this is a map of Western Australia showing the distribution of threatened species across the state. Western Australia holds about 30% of Australia's threatened flora. Unfortunately, 66% of these threatened flora occur on mining tenements, and that's in the wheat belt alone. When you look at mining activities in Western Australia, we kind of hold the lion's share for the nation with 45%, and that's probably outdated a little bit. And the land area, I guess, percentage indicated there seems to be quite small, but it's actually probably a fairly significant surface area of the state itself. And you can see some of those areas where you see a lot of mining activity. You can see the rough distribution of threatened plant species in those particular areas. And when you look at perhaps what the mining sector is going to do in the future, this map of a lot of prospects that get thrown to investors about what kind of mine sites they might be able to make a lot of money on. And you can see here in those same three kind of areas I indicated in the previous slide that there's potential for a lot of intensive mining activity in those particular areas. But on this particular map, I'd just like to highlight three other areas where you can see there's a lot of potential for more mining activities. And unfortunately, there's obviously their own suite of threatened species that occur in those areas, and they're going to be in particular ecosystems that are fairly unique that we may or may not have enough information at the moment on either. So translocations in the mining sector, obviously there's quite a few differences if you're talking about comparing it to conservation translocations themselves. It often includes the reason and decision to do the translocations in the mining sector, and the research opportunities for translocations can be a little bit different as well. The obvious challenges for working in the mining sector, at least from my point of view as a research scientist and practitioner, is the working environment. There's a lot more things you probably need to be made aware of or work around when you're working in and around mining activities. So some of the particular species that I've worked on, we've kind of found that a multifaceted research program pre-translocation and post-translocation been extremely valuable and important in informing the planning and installation of these translocations, and also being able to use these sorts of research programs to provide comparative benchmarks which you can measure success from either at that point in time or well into the future. So a little bit more about some of the challenges that you can face doing mining translocations on mine sites. The location can often be very, very different. Some translocations occur on completely engineered landforms, and obviously the soil and hydrology profiles can shift from intact and unaltered states if you're working in a natural landform into reconstructed and perhaps unfortunately even toxic substrates and landforms, which obviously have to be ameliorated and mitigated before you can even contemplate putting the plants back into that state. But I suspect the chain of custody and logistics is probably similar regardless of what kind of translocation you're going to be doing. So why design experimental translocations? I think this recent publication by CSIRO, our Commonwealth research entity, has come out recently, going beyond some of the translocation guidelines we already have, kind of summarises it quite neatly. So they're finding that embedding experiments ensures that the key questions are being assessed with your research, and if you're not implementing any experiments into your translocations, in this case mainly from a restoration point of view, you're providing little new knowledge either to the project that you're working on or to others that might need to know this information as well, and therefore you're not actually improving on any outcomes that you're going to be getting. So what can you test using experiments and translocations? Like, I'm sure the conferences provide us with a wonderful palette of what sort of things you can experiment with to try and improve your establishment, either from an animal or a plant perspective. For plants, we particularly start at the propagule, looking at whether or not you've got seed and or cutting potential, and how you can test various different techniques to improve their use. And that can also be forwarded on to sort of including other sort of technologies from a seed perspective, and or any kind of horticultural techniques that you can implement as well to improve your establishment and survival once you get to site. When it comes to optimising the environment in which you're translocating into, you often need to think about what kind of infrastructure or site amendments you need to make to improve the environment in which you're putting your plants into. And if you do have survival, then you obviously, the experiments that you've embedded into your translocation can help you understand some of the future prospects of your translocation population from a reproductive and hopefully a recruitment perspective. So if you've got these sorts of processes happening, then you know that you're well on the way to producing this resilient translocated population. So some of the example of the research questions that I've had experience with working in mine sites, they're kind of key for framing your experiment and targeting what you need to know, particularly if you don't know a lot. And ultimately all these research questions kind of feed down to the main one at the bottom there, which is which kind of approach provides your translocated plants that form your resilient and persistent population. So from a using seed point of view, you can look at experiments that investigate particular seed enhancement technologies. From your tube stock or green stock point of view, you can ask a whole raft of research questions about your pre-preparation of your tube stock, pre-planting and post-planting. So what kind of pot type will improve your planting success? Does pruning your tube stock before planting improve or negatively affect your planting? And we've also, one particular species we worked on, we looked at the application of a soil inoculum just to see whether you could give your tube stock an edge before they went out into the field. In terms of optimising species establishment, you can look at whether or not the irrigation regime plays a big part of your survival and establishment. And we found with a couple of species the time of year that you planted, and sometimes your planting and sowing requirements, your depth, also played a big part in your outcomes of your translocation. In terms of optimising the restoration environment, you can have a look at sort of infrastructure like artificial shading, or the application of some horticultural products like water crystals. And some of the research questions that we were looking at around the actual landform themselves, mainly, particularly if it's a novel and constructed landform, is whether or not that substrate supports the establishment of the propagules that you're putting out. And the other kind of questions that we've designed experiments around are about position. So whether your translocation needs to be positioned in a certain part of the bigger landform, or whether at a microsite scale, whether or not your plants themselves need to have a certain position in that landform. So this is just an example of experimental design for one species that we worked on, and just need to point out a couple of things about it. One is your controls are very important. If you don't have controls, you can't compare your treatments. If you can't compare your treatments, you're not providing any new information about how effective your treatments are. In this case, we were able to include 3 particular treatments that we were able to run in this one particular translocation. And the other key aspect is replication. If you don't have replication, then you don't have any confidence around how well your treatments have worked or not. And the last part is all about planting your experimental design. Obviously some particular sites are a little bit more conducive to a lovely block design than others, but a lot of the translocated sites that I've worked with, fortunate enough, it's cleared, wonderful tiered, and it's square. So randomised block design is generally what we've used in those situations. If you want to know a little bit more about design principles in detail, I recommend going back to the that new publication by CSIRO. They've got 3 really good chapters that go into detail about design, management and monitoring. And there's a wealth of information in there to help everyone out. So looking at some of our experiences with refining techniques in mine sites with our translocations, this particular example was looking at seed propagules, and we found that our controls obviously gave us a pretty good idea that if you don't do anything, they don't do anything, and compared against our treatments where we did see some signal and response. And then with the replication that we obviously had our confidence around how well those treatments were performing, or perhaps we needed more information about whether or not they were performing. So in this particular case with this species, we found that irrigation had a really significant impact on our propagule performance. We found that we could have repeated higher performance when we use germination stimulants. But the interesting thing is when you move from the laboratory out into the field, it often shifts the landscape. So while we were able to achieve 20 to 60% in the lab, we were unable to achieve that in the field, even with irrigation. This particular example revolves around use of tube stock and green stock. We found with this particular species that the age of the tube stock was pretty important. This particular species didn't like root disturbance, so the older the plant was, the more resilient it was to the post-transplant shock. Also, the planting of this particular species was fairly important, and with this particular species we had a look at pot type as to whether or not that made any difference to your establishment and survival of the species in the translocation. And you can see here that if you're using small plastic pots, which were our standard forestry plots, whether they were irrigated or non-irrigated, you were getting survival, but they were pretty poor performers. Some of the other pot types that were available actually performed better. So it's worth your while experimenting at this stage. If you can pick the one that works 100%, at least for the biodegradable large plots, you want to get that one. You get rid of the rest and you just focus on that particular one for the bulk of your translocation. So just shifting slightly from planting onto modified landforms into natural landform, I've had some experience with a species that was being translocated into natural habitat, and for this particular one, site selection was super important in terms of gathering enough information about the species to make more informed choice. So for this species, there was pre-translocation work that looked at habitat characteristics of the plants in question. They were looked at 3 different particular scales, and the habitat characteristics were measured on individual plants in the natural population. And with that information, we're able to develop a profile, a habitat characteristic profile of the species. And once that profile was developed, we then went back to the natural landform where the translocations were going to occur and try and find those locations in the landscape. Once we're able to find those locations in the landscape, we were then able to implement over the top of that our design in terms of testing our propagule types again, seeds and tube stock, although in this particular case we were drilling holes into rock to put our tube stock into. Fortunately, we work with a mining company. And then the other part of that was we're also able to overlay some minor modifications to the environment to try and help with the establishment of the translocation to see if it would improve success. So you can see those small little shading structures to see if it would assist those plants survive in rather interesting conditions. And broad sweep conclusions overall is if you plant your propagules in locations that don't match the habitat profile that you've generated, you're going to get no survival. And obviously 8% doesn't seem like a lot, but it is a damn lot when you put a lot of plants out there. And the good thing about this particular species was that even though the survival rates was low from an experimental point of view, if your plants survive past their first summer, they will survive second, third and fourth summers. And at that point they're old enough to flower and reproduce. So for me, that's success with a big tick. So in summary, experimental design, as Leonie and Belle will probably say, is very important for translocations. We often have target species that have limited source material. There's often an inadequate knowledge about their requirements, their thresholds, their triggers. There's limited development of the approaches that are needed to establish plants, whether that's from a horticultural perspective or an implementation and installation perspective. And there's not a lot of understanding about the limitations of the planting environment, particularly if you're planting into new and novel environments. But there's also challenges involved in planting into natural landscapes that are just unoccupied, either within or outside species distributions. So experiments test techniques at small scales, and this knowledge informs translocations before you commit resources to large-scale translocation plantings. It also develops a better understanding about the ecological functionality of your species in question. It identifies best practice approaches for improving plant establishment, and this is the guidelines and the protocols that you want to develop to be able to hand on to the people that are going to be able to install or implement your translocations to the level that's required. From a mining perspective, most mine site approvals are contingent on ministerial conditions, and in those ministerial conditions they have target numbers. So if you're able to use your experiments at a small scale, you're then able to upscale to the larger numbers that are often required for mine sites to meet their ministerial conditions. And also this experimental information helps you evaluate and select sites and tests the planting environment, so you're improving on success. So experiments provide new knowledge and advance the development of resilient persistent plant populations, and they can do that because they're repeatable, quantifiable, and they're an evidence-based solution. And I'm going to finish right there.